Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Now, of course, there's a lot to cover within the 15 minutes that I have. What I do want to start off by saying is that we as Muslims do not believe that Muhammad was some type of God incarnate or angel or anything like this. Rather, he was a human being, as all prophets of God were. And so he did human things, and he was susceptible to human emotions, human fears, and so on and so forth. When we analyze the lives of certain prophets of God, be they Moses or Abraham or David or Solomon, we can look at their lives and see and criticize certain imperfections that human beings generally have. It is that is why I initially said that one can easily make explicit objections where it is much more difficult to explain elaborate, contextual, and situational issues, much of which David's allegations fall under. And I will try to the best of my ability to explain some of those issues which David was objecting against. One of the ones that I wanted to start off with was this whole notion of demonic possession and revelation from Satan, namely the satanic verses that he mentioned. First of all, this to Muslims, when a Christian makes this argument about satanic verses, is the equivalent to Gnostics making arguments that the Gospel of Thomas and so on and so forth are reliable literatures that represent Jesus and Christianity and the disciples of Christ. It's like comparing the notion that the Council of Nicaea burned all of the Gospels that disagreed with their theology and only kept the 4 within the canon that they agreed with. The idea here is that these satanic verses were not from the Prophet ﷺ. In fact, they were fairy tales to us Muslims. And we know this because according to the science of hadith, that Muslims have followed since the very outset of narrating what Muhammad ﷺ said and did. And none of the narrations about these so-called satanic verses fulfill the science of ahadith that Muslims have followed. None of the chains of narration go to the Prophet Muhammad and say that this was definitely something Muhammad ﷺ said or did. So I compare that to the equivalent of Christians denying, for example, the notion that the Council of Nicaea or the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Barnabas and so on and so forth, denying these accounts, visualizing that these are fairy tales that came later on that attempted to divert one from the essential truth. And what we Muslims have always done is that when we looked at certain narrations about or by the Prophet ﷺ, there was a lot of false information out there. Sahih al-Bukhari, or Imam Bukhari, who narrated the most authentic collections of what Muhammad said and did, rejected 99% of the narrations that he came across because they did not reach the science of ahadith and the chain of narration, the sanad, that Muslims followed from the very outset. In other words, there was a lot of false information out there about what the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said or did. And it was up to the Muslims to agree and follow according to what the closest companions and family of the Prophet ﷺ narrated about him. If it is not narrated in the most authentic collections of hadith, namely Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, then its authenticity could be doubtful. And each and every specific narration must be analyzed in this way. So a lot of what David is bringing forward to you today, it falls within what is called a da'if or da'if jiddan, meaning a weak narration or a very weak narration, and in many cases a rejected or munkar narration, meaning that the job of the collector or the compiler of the narrated sayings and utterances of the Prophet ﷺ was to collect all of the information, erroneous of authenticity. If it was being narrated and spread by the people, even if it was false and its chain of narration did not reach the Prophet ﷺ as him having said or done this, they still collected it. And this is why in my opening statement I emphasize that if all of the actions and utterances of unique prophets were documented, whether it be Moses or David or Abraham or Jesus, then the situation behind the critical analysis of those individuals would be very, very different. And the fact that Muhammad was documented shows that these people were very much influenced by the philosophies and theology that he was teaching. And particularly the good attributes that I emphasize to you. And mind you, the good attributes that I was narrating to you were directly from Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim. That the Prophet ﷺ did and said these things that are moral principles that impact us Muslims today. So that needs to be considered. Much of these, like the satanic verses, are fairy tales to Muslims, and it's actually I don't know what word I want to use, laughable to a certain extent. If I were to come to David and say, look at the Council of Nicaea, look at the Gospel of David would know that these are later fabricated accounts. And so this is the same issue with a lot of the hadith that he's quoting. In other instances, he talks about certain issues like Satan urinating in ears, and that yawning is from Satan, and so on and so forth. Many of these ahadith are also unauthentic, but generally these are metaphorical terms saying that these are things that are disliked. For example, if one oversleeps and does not wake up for prayer, that's what the hadith was talking about. The metaphor is given that Satan urinates in this person's ear. And what this generally was an emphasis, an analogy to tell the people that this is something that is very much disliked. And secondly, this was not the word and speech of God. When the Prophet ﷺ said many of the things that he said, this was not the words and speech of God. And what must be understood, that we believe that Muhammad ﷺ was a human being, that mistakes were possible unto him, but God guided him, and that the guidance of God was with him. And the issue of progressive revelation. What this means is that certain things were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ in specific situations. For example, David objects against certain wars and conquering attempts that the Prophet and the Muslims did. What needs to be understood is the environment and situation that these actions and these verses were revealed. One of the issues that he brings up is the Prophet, peace be upon him, having self-serving revelation, and so on and so forth. For example, he talks about Zayd, the son of the Prophet, when he married Zainab, the girl that was married to him. What needs to be understood contextually and situationally, according to this, to the narratives that we have, was that Zainab wanted to marry the Prophet ﷺ before she married Zayd. And the Prophet insisted that his adopted son marry her. And so this was something that the Prophet ﷺ set up. He set up the marriage between Zayd and Zainab, even though Zainab and Zainab's brother wanted her to marry the Prophet ﷺ. And so this marriage was always awkward. They were constantly didn't want to be with each other. And this is narrated in the hadith. So when the Prophet ﷺ walked in on Zainab and she was not dressed, so to say, it is said that he walked away with his eyes down and she became excited because she had already liked the Prophet ﷺ. This is a very human situation, mind you. And given the fact that she wanted to divorce him, and Zayd in turn did end up divorcing her after finding out about this, the revelation came to the Prophet ﷺ allowing this, knowing the situation. See, God understands the psychology of his people. He understands how human beings think. And this is why the first point that he made in reference to the culture of the time, whether it be influenced from Judaism, paganism, or issues outside of theology. And to make it easier for these people to accept this new religion that was telling them to do things that they were used to doing, like drinking and fornicating and using and abusing women, using and abusing slaves, burying these little girls alive. These were things that they were used to. If you're going to take a people and tell them to abandon their complete lifestyle, there are certain things that God will use to help the people come and embrace the truth without ever compromising the monotheism and truth that essentially is the bigger picture. And that is exactly what occurs in this place, in this situation. The Quran is very clear about its monotheism. The Quran is very clear that polytheism and paganism and graven images and these types of things, that they are prohibited. And so within the contextual teachings of Islam, we learn that God, in order to make it easier on the people, helped them embrace Islam by letting them do certain traditions that they were used to without compromising the truth. With reference to the self-serving revelations about him having sallallahu alaihi wasallam 4 wives and God allowing him to have more than one wife. First of all, it is not narrated or mentioned in the Quran that the Prophet asked for this. But when you're doing all of these things, discharging armies, giving people rulings, freeing slaves, doing all of the things that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam did on a daily basis, and a lot is documented in the narrations of a hadith about what the Prophet ﷺ did for his people and how he and his message changed these descendants of Ishmael ﷺ. Given that that this change was brought upon them, that they went from paganism and these evil things and these satanic things, and that a man came and taught to them that Satan is your open enemy, that stay away from satanic things like fornication and adultery and things of this nature. These were a pagan people who were not used to this theology and this mentality. And this is what the Prophet ﷺ called to. And when I mentioned the criteria of the Bible, I wanted to put it on your shoulders. That the criteria that the Old Testament puts, and it simply states this and nothing else, that one should call to the God of Abraham, the one true God. And this is the established definition that Jews have had from the very outset. I emphasize again that no denomination in history ever defined God as a triune being, 3 persons within one being, and so on and so forth. No Jewish denomination ever understood God like this. And so when this was introduced to the people, they knew that this fulfilled the criterion of a false prophet, namely Paul of Tarsus. Whereas when Muhammad came, he brought to them the message of the one true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Ishmael. And he succeeded in spreading this message to a people who were generally unfamiliar with this perspective. And this was a man who, mind you, was an illiterate man. He was an uneducated man. He did not know how to read and write. And yet he is retaining all of this information when there is no Arabic Bible at that time. There is no Arabic Old Testament. There was no Arabic New Testament. There was nothing to study from. And yet the Prophet ﷺ shared with them a massive amount of information. So much so that it could be said that the Quran contains information about Abrahamic truth, and no other text other than the Bible and the Talmuds had existed at that time that had the amount of information pertaining to the theology of Judaism and Christianity at that time. And so this was a massive amount of information. And mind you that his immediate audience were polytheists. He had to convince these polytheists to embrace this theology of one God. With the issue of black magic and so on and so forth. Again, the Prophet ﷺ was a human being. He did not have the knowledge of God. And so when certain things happened, the Prophet ﷺ reacted as a normal human being does. But what the angel did and what his environment did for him was it helped him to understand the spiritual truth that he was receiving, and it helped him move forward with it. And he never used black magic to fight black magic. He never went to these alternative sources that the pagans were using. Rather, he depended on God to protect him. So this was essentially the so-called self-serving revelation. This was actually a mercy on the Prophet ﷺ, given that he did all of the massive and intense things that he did. When he was stoned by children who left, who stoned him out of town, all of these death threats, all of this opposition and hostility. This was a mercy of Allah on the Prophet ﷺ. And had he been after women and wealth, again I emphasize to you that this was offered to him if he stopped spreading this message about one God. All of the women in the world were offered to him. All the wealth, all the keys to the Kaaba, the position. This was offered to him. He didn't need to go this route of receiving hostility and death threats and possibly even being killed by these people to gain these things. It was offered to him if he abandons it, and yet he said that do not put the sun, even if they put something, the sun in my right hand and the moon in my left, I still will not waver from this message. There was an undaunting faith in this individual, in the spiritual experiences that he was receiving, and in the message that he was giving to these people. David also said that Muhammad disagrees with the New Testament concept of God. Of course. So did the Jews. The New Testament concept of a God is an innovation and an invention that no Jewish people from any generation were ever familiar with. وَالْآخِرُ دَعْوَانَا أَنِ الْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ رَبِّ الْعَالَمِينَ.
All right, thank you, Farhan. And now David will have 15 minutes for his first rebuttal.
All right, Farhan has offered us arguments for the prophethood of Muhammad. I've raised several objections to his case and against the prophethood of Muhammad. Let's see how Farhan's rebuttal stands up to scrutiny. I began by examining Muhammad's teachings to see whether they might have a human origin. And we saw that we have many good reasons to think that the true origin of Islam was the mind of a 7th century Arabian man. I showed that the teachings and practices of Islam can be found in the Jewish Talmud, in the writings of heretical Christian groups, and even among the pagans. Farhan responded to the point about the pagans and said, God allowed people to continue their practices to make things easier on them. Well, those practices included things like kissing a black stone. Muslims today, following the example set by Muhammad, which was a pagan practice, will go to Mecca and attempt to kiss this black stone, which they believe came down from heaven. This is simply idolatry. And so it makes very little sense to say that you have the true monotheistic teachings, and yet God is allowing idolatry to creep into the religion. But apart from this, the teachings of Islam, the teachings we find in the Quran, stories about Jesus and Mary, and things from the Talmud, things about Cain and Abel and Abraham, we know where these stories come from. These come from documents written in the 4th and 5th century, things in the Talmud, things written by heretical Christian groups. We know, we can pinpoint the origin of these stories, and we know that they were written. Some of them were written as fables. Some of them were on the level of bedtime stories. The Companions of the Cave in the Quran was written almost on the level of a fable. It wasn't to be taken seriously, and yet Muhammad just couldn't tell the difference. So we're trying to establish a probability here. What seems like the most likely explanation of what we find here? Well, what we find is in Arabia there were stories circulating. Some of those stories were true. Some of those stories were false. And Muhammad just couldn't tell the difference between the two. So when Muhammad heard one story from one Jewish group, he took it just as he would take any other story, even if the story was false. This doesn't look like something that came down from heaven. Again, this looks like exactly what we would expect from a religion that arises in 7th century Arabia. We've seen that some of Muhammad's revelations have no purpose but to satisfy his desires. Muhammad received revelations establishing his right to have more sexual partners than anyone else. Muhammad received revelations justifying his marriage to the divorced wife of his own adopted son. Farhan says that these revelations were a mercy on Muhammad because he had such a rough life. Therefore, God gave him special moral privileges. Well, I guess you can look at things like that, but I'll be honest, I don't care how rough my life gets. I don't want extra wives or anything else going on. Come on. Do you mean to tell me that if you get persecuted, if you have a tough life, you get persecuted as a person, if you get persecuted as a Christian, that God is going to come down and say, I'm going to give you a bunch of special moral privileges that I forbid. I forbid in my perfect holy book. And I'm going to give you these special privileges. This doesn't look like what we come to expect from God. This, again, looks like something that came from Muhammad's own mind. Farhan pointed out that Muhammad didn't accept bribes. I agree. Muhammad did believe that he was a real prophet. And if someone said, hey, leave Islam and become a pagan or something like that, or leave us alone, no, he was not going to do that. What I'm questioning here is what we find over and over and over again in the Muslim sources, namely that Muhammad has some desire, and all of a sudden a revelation comes. You get that, Muhammad. Again, even Muhammad's own wife noticed this and said that God seems to just rush down and satisfy his desires. It's interesting. Now, concerning Zayd and Zainab, he says that Muhammad set up the marriage, true. And he says that, this marriage was kind of bad, and so Muhammad felt like he should go ahead and marry this woman. Just imagine this. Suppose you adopt someone, you adopt a child, and that child grows up, and you eventually arrange a marriage for that child, and the marriage doesn't go well. Are you going to marry the woman? I don't know, because that's the example set by Muhammad. Again, a Muslim can look at this and say, I don't see a problem here. What we're doing is we're looking at the evidence and saying, are these revelations from God? Because according to Muslims, this revelation was eternal in the Quran. Before Muhammad was ever born, this revelation was eternal in heaven, and it comes down in order to justify Muhammad's desire for a woman. That's what it says. Muhammad saw her, he was attracted to her, revelation comes. Again, you're free to believe whatever you want, but what does this look like? What's the most obvious explanation of this? Well, considering we see over and over again in the Muslim sources that every time Muhammad had a desire, it seemed to be satisfied, this looks awfully suspicious. We've seen that some of Muhammad's teachings seem just plain silly. Satan sleeps in your nose, urinates in your ears, passes wind while you're praying, and so on. He says, well, these teachings weren't necessarily from God. Muhammad could make mistakes. I agree, so I'm going to grant that point. And if you're willing to say that Muhammad made mistakes and that these teachings weren't really from God, I'm fine with that. So these are the sorts of things that we would expect from a man starting a religion in 7th century Arabia. These portions of the religion seem entirely human. But we've also seen that there's something much more sinister at work in Muhammad's teachings. Muhammad accepts so much about Jesus. He accepts the virgin birth. He accepts Jesus' miracles. He calls Jesus the Messiah. And yet there were 3 things that Muhammad had to deny about Jesus, and they just happened to be the 3 key elements of the gospel according to the New Testament. It's a coincidence. Farhan pointed out that, I had said that Muhammad rejected the Christian concept of God as a being who has love for everyone. He says, of course, Muhammad rejected this concept. Well, that's just the point. This was a concept that Jesus brought. He says God sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. God loves everyone, and he tells people that's why we're supposed to greet everyone in love. Not just people who like us, not just our brothers. We are to greet everyone in love. Why? Because God loves everyone. And Jesus says, if you don't surpass the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, you're not a part of the kingdom of God. And this was in the context of him laying down his doctrines about God's love. So again, I'm pointing out that Farhan has said there are criteria in the Bible that we can use to recognize a false prophet. I'm showing that Muhammad fails these criteria. We saw that Muhammad's first impression of his revelations was that he was demon-possessed. Sometimes first impressions are the correct ones. Imagine, think about this. Muhammad is the only prophet in history to come along to get a revelation. It sounds like he was being choked by this being. He ran out of there. It made him depressed. It made him suicidal. Think about this. If you encounter a spiritual being, it makes you suicidal and depressed, and you think this is a horribly evil being, maybe it's not from God. We should think about that. We saw that the early Muslim sources declare that Muhammad delivered revelations from the devil, the infamous satanic verses. Farhan says that the sources I appeal to are like Gnostic sources, that there's no reliable chain of transmission. He points out that al-Bukhari threw out a number of narrations, and that these stories are not in the most reliable collections of ahadith. As far as not being in the collections of ahadith, this was a different type of literature. These are sirah works. Muslims had different types of literature. They had the tafsir, these were the commentaries on the Quran. They had the sirah literature, these were straightforward biographies. And they had the ahadith, which were teachings about Muhammad that Muslims were supposed to follow. This story, the satanic verses, is part of the sirah literature, and so it doesn't make a lot of sense to apply hadith collections to this as a criteria. It's a different type of literature. But if you'd like to know where the sources go, we have around 37 sources for this story. I'll give you a breakdown of them. 6 go back to Ka'b al-Qurazi, one of Islam's greatest early Quranic scholars. 5 sources go back to Urwa ibn al-Zubair, an early Meccan scholar who's also known as the founder of the study of the life of Muhammad. He was Aisha's nephew, Abu Bakr's grandson, and the son of Abu Bakr's daughter Asma, one of the first 20 converts to Islam. 2 of the narrations go back to Abu Bakr ibn al-Harith, one of the top scholars of Islamic law during the first century of Islam. 5 go back to Abu al-Aliyah al-Basri, another of the greatest Quranic scholars of the first century. He studied the Quran with Umar, Caliph, with Ubay ibn Ka'b, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Ibn Abbas. Those of you who know those names know that these were the top people in the early Muslim community. 2 go back to al-Sudi, another early scholar who studied with Ibn Abbas. 1 comes from the tafsir of Muhammad ibn al-Sa'ib al-Kalbi, an early commentator who composed the longest tafsir that had been written up to his time. 4 reports go back to Qatada, one of Islam's greatest early commentators. 1 goes back to al-Dahak, a first century expert in tafsir. 1 goes back to Ikrimah, a slave of Ibn Abbas and an expert on the life of Muhammad. We have 6 reports that go back to Ibn Abbas himself, a companion of Muhammad and the founder of Quranic studies. And we have several that go back to Sa'id ibn Jubair, one of the leading Quranic scholars of his time and one of the top students of Ibn Abbas. Now, these are the sources. We have a ton of chains of transmission that go back to the first century of Islam, and it's to almost all of their most reliable early authorities. And Farhan says, no, you have to throw all of that out. Well, okay, if you want to throw all of that out, don't tell me ever that you know anything about Muhammad. If your earliest scholars and experts in history were all a bunch of liars who would invent stories about Muhammad passing on revelations from the devil, don't tell me you can trust anything that comes from these people. In other words, you have to throw out everything you know about Muhammad. In case you don't know, the major collections of ahadith he refers to were written around 2 centuries, begin around 2 centuries after the time of Muhammad. If you can't trust your earliest scholars, how are you going to trust sources that come centuries later? It makes no sense. So you have a bit of a dilemma here. Either grant that the early Muslim community transmitted information accurately, in which case you have to grant the satanic verses, or you can say that all of your earliest people were unreliable, in which case you know absolutely nothing about Muhammad. Take your pick. Either way, it's not very pretty. So what do we have? According to all our earliest Muslim sources, Muhammad delivered revelations from the devil. According to Moses, that makes him a false prophet, in a passage that Farhan appealed to in his opening statement. We saw that Muhammad was the victim of black magic and that someone was able to give him false beliefs using a hairbrush. Farhan says that Muhammad depended on God to protect him. True. That's not the point. The point was that it's very strange to see God, one of God's greatest servants and greatest messengers, and anyone can sort of take him out for a year by getting a hair from his hairbrush. This makes no sense. And Farhan, if you think this sort of thing really works, I'll tell you what. Go out, find a magician, get Harry Potter, get Gandalf, get anyone you want, get Sabrina the Teenage Witch, and come here and try to cast a spell on me. I promise you it's not going to work. So we have good reasons to believe that some of Muhammad's revelations came from his own mind, and we have good reasons to believe that some of Muhammad's revelations came from demonic influence. But do we have any reason to believe that Muhammad's revelations came from God? Well, going back to Farhan's arguments, Farhan, in his rebuttal, said that he is emphasizing the criterion: you call people to the one true God, and that this is how you spot a true prophet. Well, it's under investigation whether the doctrine of God presented by Muhammad is the doctrine of the one true God. If he can establish that, then he'll have something, but he's missing the point here. We have other criteria in the Bible. We're given several criteria. If you want to know whether someone's a true prophet or a false prophet, here are some criteria. And in Deuteronomy 18:20, if a person delivers a revelation that doesn't come from God or speaks in the name of other gods, false prophet. Guess what? According to all of the earliest Muslim sources, combined with that Deuteronomy 18:20, Muhammad was a false prophet. How can anyone say that he's using the biblical criterion for a false prophet when Muhammad meets that biblical criterion? He says that Paul brought false teachings. Paul brought false teachings. I don't understand why we're talking about Paul. We're simply asking a question of whether Muhammad was a prophet. But keep in mind, Paul was a Shammite Pharisee. These were the most die-hard Pharisees there were. The early Christian community was Jewish. These people obviously saw something so astounding that they were willing to believe in it. What did they see? They saw Jesus of Nazareth going around claiming to be divine, and then dying on the cross and rising from the dead. Given that, they said, all right, that's the truth. And they converted. And some said, no, it doesn't matter how much evidence you have, we're not going to believe anything other than what we believe. Think about this. Think about that reaction. You have the Pharisees on one hand, and they say, hey, look, it doesn't matter. I don't care if you rise from the dead. I don't care how many miracles you perform. I'm not going to believe anything other than what I'm taught right now to believe. And then you have other people who say, all right, this isn't what I was taught when I was growing up. This isn't what my parents taught me. But this man is obviously from God. There is no way around this, and therefore I'm going to believe him. We see that reaction. We see the same responses in the world today. We have Muslims. It doesn't matter how much evidence there is for the resurrection. It doesn't matter how much evidence there is that Jesus claimed to be divine. It's not what we're taught. We're not going to believe it. And we have other people saying, well, look, it's obvious Jesus rose from the dead, given the evidence, and it's obvious, given all the early evidence, that he claimed to be divine, and therefore we will submit. I would suggest, Farhan, that you become one of the people who submits to God and the evidence he's offered. Concerning historical accuracy, Farhan said that Muhammad knew tons of things. He talked to Jews, and he knew tons of information about Old Testament figures and so on. Look, Muhammad talked to Jews and Christians regularly, and his critics pointed this out. Hey, you're just getting this from the Jews and Christians around here. When he was in Medina, there were 3 tribes of Jews there. And Farhan says, how did Muhammad know all these stories? Well, he was around a bunch of people who were telling these stories. Not only that, he got a ton of his information wrong. So I don't see this as any kind of evidence for Islam. Regarding the argument for moral excellence, he says that people were influenced by Muhammad's principles. True, because they're told in the Quran to model themselves after the life of Muhammad. So what do we have here? We have no reason to believe that Muhammad's revelations came from God, but we still have good reasons to believe that some of his revelations came from his own mind and that others came from demonic sources. The only reasonable conclusion to draw is still that Muhammad was a false prophet.
Thank you, David. We will now move into the second rebuttal, which these are 10 minutes each Farhan.
Judgment on true prophets. We know that false prophets produce miracles, wonders, signs, and things of this nature. Earlier, David criticized that poetry is not a miracle. That is the miracle that was relevant to the culture of the people of that time. That's what God used to melt their hearts. Of course, there were other miracles that were produced, such as the splitting of the moon and some other narratives where certain companions witnessed the laws of nature being defied. But the issue here is that false prophets can produce miracles as well. Even if Muhammad did something spectacular, miraculous, according to the criteria of the Bible, that does not mean he's a true prophet of God. Why? Because that person could do that and still speak in the name of other gods. And the criteria that David and I have both reiterated several times that Moses talks about in Deuteronomy 18:20 is that if the individual speaks in the name of other gods, that person is a false prophet. And my argument with this is it is Christianity that introduces these new concepts about God, and not Muhammad. Muhammad is the one who is inviting the descendants of Ishmael back to the God of Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac. It's the complete opposite. Muhammad is fulfilling the criteria, whereas Christianity is not in this regard. With reference to Muhammad getting all of these stories and information from so many different people. I mean, first of all, there's a lot of information to be acquired here, especially for a person who could document his knowledge. But first of all, there was no Arabic Bible at that time. And what David is presenting to you is all theory. It's all assumptions that he acquired information that he acquired all of this information from others. Just because it doesn't exist within the writings of the New Testament, for example, doesn't mean that these stories have truth to them. What the Quran claims is that it is the muhaymin, meaning the criterion to decipher what is true and what is false. That is what the Quran claims for itself. And so just because these stories are not found in your canonized Bible does not mean that this is revelation and truth from God. With reference to David not wanting many wives because he does so many things during the day or wants special moral privileges, we live in a totally different society today. This was 7th century Arabia that we were talking about. The Prophet, being a human being, lived in a culture that used and abused women, and he lived in a culture where women were treated and dressed provocatively and so on and so forth. He was a human being with the mindset of a 7th century Arabian, of a 7th century Arab. I agree with David. I mean, he's a human being. He's a creation of God. I don't expect him to be perfect and be God or be angelic. What God did was He had mercy on him, just as He had mercy on certain other prophets of God. If David had 99 concubines, and God allowed it and didn't instruct him to do otherwise, this isn't something to be looked down upon. Yet, again, there are situational verses of the Quran that apply universally or apply to certain situations or applied in the past to certain prophets of God and to certain situations. And while the universal commandment or instruction within the Quran is that you can marry 2, 3, or 4, but it's better to marry only one, while this is the universal application upon believers from this point forward, God had mercy on the Prophet ﷺ in this manner that He allowed more marriages than what was universally applied. I don't see that this is He didn't ask for these favors. Rather, God gave it to him because He knew of his inmost desires as a human being. That God had mercy on him in order to help him remain steadfast in the mission that was ahead. David says that while the Quran accepts the virgin birth, calls Jesus a Messiah, and so on and so forth, but rejects the 3 major principles of Christianity. Well, these 3 major principles of Christianity that you're talking about, the very notions violate any understanding that any Jewish people from any generation had of their scriptures. This isn't something that just Muslims are disagreeing with. This is something that the Jewish people were taught from the very outset of Revelation. They were not familiar with a triune God. They were not familiar or taught about some man-God sacrifice for the sins of mankind on a cross. They were not taught about the Messiah being a divine person who would incarnate and do all of these things that are taught in the New Testament. These teachings were never believed by any Jewish people. How can over 4,000 years of Jews never conclude that God is a triune God? Did they the God that Abraham prayed to, the God that Moses prayed to, they never defined God as triune. They never defined that the Messiah acts as a Superman God sacrifice for the entirety of mankind. These were things that were introduced after the appearance of Jesus, and were never concluded upon, and there's no documentation, whether in the Torah or the Talmuds, that these notions apply. They violate the Hebrew Tanakh. And likewise, they violate the Quran. We disagree and reject those notions as well. David admits that this is from the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, meaning that a biography written according to all of the cumulative narratives that Ibn Hisham, for example, or At-Tabari had at that time. What we Muslims have always followed from the standards of scholarship that was established with the first four scholars of Islam on the issues of fiqh and jurisprudence. There were four scholars who set the standards for scholarship of Islam in the second generation of Muslims. And they said, if your evidence is not from the Quran and from the authentic narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, then we want nothing to do with it. So if a seerah or a biography was written, if it is not backed by verses of the Quran or authentic narrations of the Prophet ﷺ, then we are, according to our scholars that came way before Ibn Hisham and At-Tabari, that we are to reject these notions. And our scholars have constantly said that if somebody comes to you, ask them, where is your evidence from the Quran and the authentic narrations of the Prophet ﷺ? And David here admits that this is not something from the Quran or the Hadith, from the narrations and sayings and utterances and actions of the Prophet, rather from these seerah sources. With reference to satanic verses, the story was definitely spread. People narrated this story to different people, definitely. We agree with this. This is something that is documented. But so is the story of the Council of Nicaea. Just because people narrate a story to so many different types of people does not make that story authentic. If the Muslims have a standard for accepting and rejecting a hadith, then that is the standard that should be used when analyzing an alleged statement or utterance or action of the Prophet ﷺ. If it does not meet those standards that Muslims have followed since the very outset of narration, then those narrations are and always have been rejected from the early Muslim generations. And mind you, the ahadith, these narrations existed. He talks about 200, 100 years, that the hadith began to be compiled. That these narrations existed prior to the compilation. They're simply compiled into books at a certain period. Rather, the narrations did exist. And the chains of narrations did exist. And we only accept the ahadith whose chain of narrations has the closest companions of the Prophet ﷺ and narrate that he ﷺ, the Prophet, the Messenger Muhammad, said it. I will also not deny that people tried to kill him. They tried to poison him. They tried to use black magic on him. This is something that the Prophet admits, that that he was receiving these types of threats and actions against him. And this is not something that, the opposition was regularly trying to bring harm to the Prophet ﷺ, but he remained steadfast and his ministry continued. It continued on and it was successful. You get 30 seconds.
Thank you. David, you have 10 minutes.
Well, our debate is almost over. Let's see where we're at. I've argued that we have good reasons to believe that some of Muhammad's revelations had a purely human origin. We find all of the building blocks of Islam in 7th century Arabia, even though some of these building blocks were obviously false stories and pagan practices. Muhammad received revelations giving him quite silly. Farhan responds, just because stories aren't found in the Bible doesn't mean that they're false. True, we have tons of historical information that isn't found in the Bible. I don't dispute that. But I think Farhan has missed the point here. In the Quran, we know where certain stories in the Quran come from, and they weren't historical at all. And even people at the time knew they weren't historical, and Muhammad just didn't. We also know that certain stories had no historical background and were based on, for instance, mistranslations, things like that, and yet Muhammad just didn't know. I'll give you a few examples. In Surah 18, Muhammad says that Alexander the Great traveled so far west, he found the place where the sun sets. According to the Quran, the sun sets in a pool of murky water. We know where this story comes from. It comes from a work titled The Glorious Deeds of Alexander, which was circulating in Arabia during the time of Muhammad. Now, is this story historically accurate? Did Alexander the Great travel so far west he found the place where the sun sets? Of course not. That's absolutely absurd. There is no place where the sun sets. And yet this was a story circulating about Alexander, and then it ends up in the Quran. So, is this a case of, well, it's not in the Bible, so I'm just going to reject the story? Is that what I'm saying? I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying it's obviously not a true story, and yet it ended up in the Quran. Therefore, Muhammad was clearly getting his teachings from unreliable sources. And we see this over and over again. Stories about Cain and Abel, stories about Abraham, stories about Mary and Jesus, stories that are obviously not correct, and they ended up in the Quran. This is evidence that Muhammad was not a true prophet. Farhan says that, Farhan agrees with me that Muhammad had the mindset of a 7th century Arab, and therefore, we have to let Muhammad slide on lots of things. That's fine. I agree. And as long as we're clear that this is not the view that I encounter usually with Muslims, then we're fine. Farhan seems to have a view that allows much more errors and flaws in Muhammad's life, and I have no problem with that. He says that God made exceptions for other prophets. We see in the Old Testament David and other prophets doing bad things, and what's the problem here? Well, in Islam, everyone's told to be like Muhammad. And when we see Muhammad having sex with a 9-year-old girl and allowing his followers to rape female captives and robbing people and slaughtering people for disagreeing with him, this is the example that all Muslims are told to follow. Are we told, hey, if Solomon married 300 women, you should do the same? No, we're not told to do that at all. And that's the difference here. I also argued that we have good reasons for believing that some of Muhammad's revelations have a demonic origin. Islam seems like it's designed to keep people from believing the gospel. Muhammad's first impression of his revelations was that he was demon-possessed. Muhammad admittedly delivered revelations from Satan. Muhammad was the victim of black magic. Here Farhan says that Muslims have always demanded proof from the Quran or other authentic narrations. True, Muslims prefer authentic narrations. Farhan makes a mistake of concluding that only ahadith, only their most reliable collections of ahadith contain reliable transmissions. He says that this has always been the Muslim position. No, this was nothing like the Muslim position for the first 2 centuries of Islam. This was a later innovation. When we go back to the earliest Muslim history, we find that Muslims had different types of literature. If it was for a practice of Muhammad that Muslims were supposed to follow, then they had a certain method, the method that they use in ahadith. If it was simple biographical material, telling about what happened in the Muslim community, telling just something general that happened in the life of Muhammad, it was a different type of literature. It was the seerah literature. And just think about the names. Think about the names that I went back to in talking about all the people, all the early sources on the satanic verses. It was astounding. It was people like Ibn Abbas. This is who we're dealing with. Again, I leave you with the dilemma. If these people, if so many of your earliest first century scholars and experts on the life of Muhammad were all passing around completely false stories, fine, if you want to believe that, don't tell me you know anything about Muhammad. So everything that Farhan has told us about Muhammad this afternoon, we have to reject based on his criteria. Farhan, so I'll just advise Farhan to examine, for instance, the work of Shahab Ahmed, who is a Muslim scholar at Harvard and who has talked a great deal about the satanic verses. And he's pointed out the flaws and errors in Muslim thinking now when Muslims try to declare what the earliest method was. It's not that Muslims today do not understand what the earliest method of historical investigation was. When we do, the only conclusion to draw is that Muhammad did deliver the satanic verses. And once we've concluded that, we see based on Deuteronomy 18, as Farhan has pointed out, that Muhammad had to be a false prophet. Farhan says that the story of the satanic verses exists, but so does the story of the Council of Nicaea. Well, the Council of Nicaea happened too. That's certainly true. But Farhan has said that these stories are like stories of the Gnostic Gospels. No. Why do we reject the Gnostic Gospels? Because we have much earlier sources. The Gnostic sources came much later from a totally different area, from people who had no clue about the life of the historical Jesus. That's why we reject them. What's the situation in Islam? All of your earliest sources talk about the satanic verses. It's not until a couple of centuries later that Muslims start rejecting these stories. So we find the exact opposite. Now, the only question before us then is whether we have any good evidence that outweighs the difficulties that we've seen. Farhan has argued that Christianity, he's argued this repeatedly, even though we're not debating Christianity, he says that Christianity brings a false concept of God. Jews didn't believe in the Trinity. Well, I mean, even if you open the very first verses of the Bible, you find God describing himself with the pronoun we over and over, and then using singular verbs. Now, Muslims often explain this with the Quran by saying that this is the plural of majesty. Go ask a Hebrew scholar if Jews had anything even remotely resembling a plural of majesty or a royal we. They had no such thing. You don't see David using the royal we because he's king. You don't see anyone in the Old Testament using this royal we. This was always simply a puzzle for Jews. Why is God describing himself like this? And it's when we receive the fuller revelation of the New Testament that we find out. So according to Farhan, if you don't have something taught right there at the beginning in completely clear terms, God can never give us a fuller knowledge of his nature. And I simply have to reject that. God can describe himself in terms. People can be puzzled for a while, and then God can come in there and explain things to us more clearly. If Farhan disagrees with this, we're going to have lots of problems with the Quran. He says that Muhammad had no access to a Torah in Arabic. Well, I mean, Muhammad it wouldn't have mattered. He couldn't read. That's not the point, though. The point is Muhammad was around Jews who spoke Arabic. Even if the Torah hadn't been translated into Arabic, he is talking to people who know it. And Muhammad, interestingly, was accused over and over and over again from taking all these stories, from taking his stories about Judaism and about Christianity and from all these sources that people generally knew were not true. He was accused over and over again of taking this, and we find this even in the Quran. Consider a few passages. In the Quran, Surah 8:31, we read, Allah says, when our signs are rehearsed to them, they say, so when they hear the Quran, when our signs are rehearsed to them, they say, we have heard this before. If we wished, we could say words like these. These are nothing but tales of the ancients. In the Quran, Surah 16:103, we know indeed that they say, it is a man that teaches him. So people are going around saying, Muhammad's just getting this from someone else. And we know who that was. There was a Christian. There was a Christian that Muhammad was. The Christian went around saying, Muhammad's just getting all his information from me. Muhammad talked to this man, and so he's talking to Christians, he's talking to Jews, and Farhan thinks it's absolutely miraculous that he knew anything about Judaism and Christianity. I don't see that it is. So we know indeed that they say, it is a man that teaches him. The tongue of him they wickedly point to is notably foreign, while this is Arabic pure and clear. So Muhammad's defense was, this guy's a foreigner, so I couldn't have copied anything from him. Well, if you're talking to him, you can obviously understand what he's saying. In the Quran, Surah 24:4-5, but the misbelievers say, naught is this but a lie which he has forged, and others have helped him at it. In truth, it is they who have put forward an iniquity and a falsehood, and they say, tales of the ancients, which he has caused to be written, and they are dictated before him morning and evening. People are saying Muhammad is talking to Jews, he's talking to Christians, he's talking to all sorts of people, he's talking to the pagans, and he's coming up with all these stories. This is the Quran. The Quran. In the Quran, we find people accusing Muhammad of getting his information from other people. So it's not surprising. It shouldn't be surprising that Muhammad knew things about Christianity. So our debate is nearly over, and we've seen absolutely no evidence that Muhammad was a prophet, but we do have tons of evidence that he was a false prophet.